Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. For today's Shopsmith tutorial, I'm going to be doing the reassembly of the headstock for my 1960 Greenie Shopsmith headstock. And I recently had it apart before I did this video, and so I won't be lubing my headstock, but I will explain during the video the different points that I think are crucial to lube. So follow along and we'll get this put back together. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is put this clamp back together. If you removed it or you replaced the headstock casing, this will be the first step that I would do. As you can see here, this is assuming that you already have the handle reinstalled, which uses the cotter key to hold the handle on, and then it's got the double-sided screw which turns both of the clamps on both sides of the case. So what I did was I threaded the far side clamp onto the bolt there a little ways, and now what I'm doing is holding the one on the handle side and spinning that out until it's close to even. And what I usually end up doing is I adjust this before I actually get it all put back together and try to get it back onto the way tubes. And the way that I do this, as you can see, I'm checking the gap between the handle right here. So I want that gap to be about as close as possible when it's fully loosened. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back it off and then turn whichever side I need it to. So what I'm doing right now is I'm turning the far side clamp piece onto the threads a little more, so that it won't hit the other side of the case as early. So that way when I spin it all together, it'll put the handle closer to the case. So we'll just fast forward through this a little bit. It's just me fine-tuning the adjustment. So once I got this set up, the first thing I'm going to do is put that cam back in for the lower pulley. And you can see one side is smooth and the other side has that groove in it, so you can adjust it with a screwdriver. So I'm going to orient that, and then I'm going to slide that in, and that should have enough tension on it that it may be a little bit difficult to slide in, but once you get in it should stay there. So that is why I'm putting this in right now and not when I do the pulley later. You also want to make sure it's smooth on the end so that you don't have to do a whole lot of adjusting once you decide to put the rest together. So I want to put the quill feed back in. What I got here is the quill feed sleeve, and we're going to slide that in the back side. And it does have a groove in it, but at this point you don't have to entirely worry about the orientation of the slot for the key on the shaft. You can kind of just push it in, make sure it's flush, and there should be about the right amount of gap for the washer that goes after this. So this is the washer. You can see it's a little concave on one side, it's flat on the other. Here's the quill feed pinion. You can see there's an alignment mark there and the flat spot that will stop that indicator when it turns for your quill extension. So here you see I set the washer in there between the sleeve and the part of the headstock housing. And then I slid that shaft through, and then you can turn that entire shaft once it's engaged in the sleeve, and that sleeve will turn with it. That way you can get the orientation correctly and make sure that it's actually fully engaged. So here you can see I'm doing a fine-tune adjustment of that indicator as I was mentioning. And from once you get that lined up, what you want to do is run this set screw down. It's just an Allen wrench. You want to set that down and get it fairly snug. I don't think you have to have a lot of pressure on it, but once you get that snug down, it should stay together for the most part, because that quill sleeve that's on the back side will be held in by the clamp, as you'll see here in a little bit. So next we're going to put the dial and the wing nuts on here, and you can see that this one is shorter because of this dial, whereas the one that goes on the other side of the case is longer. So you want to make sure you have the right one for the right side. So you can see those washers with the keys in my hand. So I'm going to put the side that has the hash marks in it, that's more abrasive, toward the dial, and then I'm going to slide the dial over that. and followed by the other washer with the abrasive toward the dial again. So you can see here I put this dial on, and you can spin it and it'll hit that stop point from both directions. So that's the way that works, is it engages and you can actually set the limit on how far your extension goes. So here I'm putting that other washer on, followed by the short wing nut. So before I put this washer on the other side, you can see it's kind of bent, and what that does is it serves to act like a spring. So when I put that on, I usually put it so the bumps stick out towards the handle, so it'll kind of push that hill that's in that washer down and serve as a clamping action or spring to maintain the pressure on that. So on the other end of the headstock, we're going to put this drive assembly in. And if you took the cap off, you're going to put that back on. And I also recommend putting about 3 drops of 3M oil or household oil inside. So with the plastic cap on, you want to make sure and have your belt handy, because you're going to want to set that into the gap there before you put the shaft through, otherwise you won't be able to get the belt on. So you should be able to slide this through. I'm not saying it should be easy, but you may have to push a little bit and kind of get it set in there nice and seated, and then that belt you can just push right down on there and it'll engage those teeth and spin for you. So next we have the ring that we pulled out earlier, and you want to make sure and start the same side you had in is what I recommend. So you kind of want to open it up a little bit, making sure not to bend it, and get it started in the groove. And then from there you can kind of work your way around and get it worked into the groove inside of there, right outside of the bearing for this quill sleeve assembly. And you'll see once I have it all pressed in here, what I'll do is I'll grab my pick and I'll work my way around just to make sure it's seated in that groove and it's not sticking out anywhere, because you don't want that coming apart on you if you didn't get that in there all the way. So one way that I actually do this to push that bearing in is, you can see this spindle knob right there it sits inside the quill a little bit, and then I'll just use my power coupling hubs and stack them, and then use my dead blow to just tap on the quill itself, and usually that should be enough to drive that bearing into the seat. So I'll pull that back off just to make sure, and you can see now it's pressed down inside there fairly nicely. So the next thing we want to do is put our C-clip inside of that. If you don't have a C-clip pliers, it will be a little bit of a pain, but I think you can manage it. But I do recommend, if you don't have a set of C-clip pliers, you can pick up a set for fairly cheap, and you can use those because they come in handy. And if you need to tear your headstock apart at a later date, you can just use those, because you can see how simply that snaps right in there. And then what I'll do is I'll just turn those pliers a little bit just to make sure it sits down into the groove inside of the quill here. So next we're going to put that spindle knob on, now that we've got that C-clip in there. And that's just an Allen screw. You want to make sure that's nice and seated against your quill. And what I do is I line that Allen screw up with where the Allen screw will be for my other attachments, like the saw blade assembly and things like that. So I line that up, and then you just want to tighten it up and make sure it's fairly solid. And then if your rubber ring fell off, just slide that back on, because that's something you don't want to do without, because that takes a lot of the slamming and banging when the quill slides back. So you can see it's got teeth on there. We want the teeth to be on the bottom so that we've got that groove on top, so that that set screw that holds the quill in will be able to go down into that groove. So what I'm doing here is I'm reaching underneath and I am guiding the back side of the shaft into the drive assembly on the back side of the headstock there. And once you get that slid in a little bit, it'll only slide in so far as to the teeth that are on the quill feed pinion. So here you can see I'm making sure that the spring is backed up all the way, and you don't want to turn this the wrong way. So from that side of the headstock that I'm on, I typically go about 3 to 3.5 turns, and that seems to be about right for the quill to have the right amount of spring pressure and be able to return all the way, and still, once it gets back against that rubber ring, it'll still have some tension on it. So here we go, 1, 2, 3, and about half, I believe. Yep, right there's the half. So I'm going to slide that back, and then I'm just going to give that handle a wiggle until the teeth engage on the quill itself. And then I'm going to reach underneath, and what I'm doing is just making sure it guides correctly into the sleeve there. So what I'm doing here is I'm turning both sides of the shaft to make sure that it engages, and then you can let it spring back into the case. So while I've got it partially extended here, what I want to do is I want to set that screw, the set screw that retains the quill, because that's about in the middle of the groove on the quill itself. So what I'm doing is I want to loosen that up just a little bit, and all I'm doing is giving a little bit of side-to-side action just to make sure that that set screw is in the middle of that groove. And then what I'll do is I'll loosen the clamp back up and use the handle to set the tension on it, because all it has to do is ride in that groove. It doesn't have to lock the quill down or do it be extremely tight, anything like that. It's just there as a retainer. So I'm basically just setting a nice point for that until I find a happy medium where it's not restricting the quill coming out and it's still serving its purpose as riding in the groove. So you can see right there it won't slide all the way out. So with the sheave removed so we don't drop it, we want to take the idler shaft and insert it through the belt into the cam. And you may have to pull on this a little bit in order to get it to line up so that it slides in correctly. And while holding the end of the shaft, you want to tighten that Allen screw so that you can tighten the cam onto the outside of that bearing assembly that's on the idler there. That way you can keep that from moving. And the tension that's on the cam should keep this idler shaft from falling out. So at this point you can install the Allen screw and the nut that are on the bottom, but you don't want to tighten them because you're going to use a straight screwdriver to turn the cam, and this will allow you to adjust the tension on the belt. And once you get that set where you need it, then you can tighten down the clamp, as you'll see here in a bit. So once this is done, you can insert your Phillips screw, which goes in that hole above the shaft. It's usually easier to start it by hand and then just get it tightened up that way. And what that does is that acts as a safety so that your cam cannot slide out too far and slide out of the case. At this point you can set your case back on the end and grab your sheave, and you can see the piece that I'm spinning here is what you want to make sure that it's well oiled and it spins freely like it does. There should be a hole on this casing behind that bearing that I was just spinning, so you want to make sure and get some oil in there. Then you want to line up the keyway on your sheave, and you can slide that onto your idler shaft. And once you get that actually slid on, we're going to tip this case back down, so that should stay on, but you have to remember that it's not held on by anything at the moment. So you want to hold on to it as you tip the case on its end. So you can do this part with it standing up, but I just wanted to show you that right now I'm holding the sheave and I'm going to install the speed control. And I'm doing it this way just so you can see it, because the arm on the speed control will actually hold that sheave on the bottom side. So you can see right there where it's supporting it. So if you wanted to set it flat on its side and then do that, you can do it that way as well. So either way works. So from this point we're going to install our 3 screws into our speed control, including it should be that metal, I called it a spring. Mine is broken. Yours, the other end of that spring should go between 2 points. You should be able to see them on the speed control here. So you want to put it in between those 2 points, and then after you get all 3 started, then tighten them all down. So once we got those tightened down, we can put our speed control handle on. And you can't really see it, but there is an indentation in the shaft right here where you want to line that Allen screw up, and then you can get your Allen wrench and tighten that down. So at this point what we want to do is increase the speed control to pull that arm back. You can see it raising here until it's about center, so that we can get the sheave lined up and clipped on later. For now we want to put that belt on. You may have to do a little bit of finagling, but you want to go over the bearing on that sheave, and then you may have to work that sheave a little bit in order to get the belt between the sheave and the idler shaft. Once that's done, you can lift the sheave clip and slide it over the spring that's on the end of the speed control arm and actually attach the clip. And once that's done, we want to be very careful about adjusting the speed control without spinning the shaft. So at this point we can set it on its back and get our motor, and what we want to do is route those cables to that switch the same way they were when we pulled it apart. And once we get that set through the hole, we can take our nut and we can turn that nut onto the switch in order to secure it. And once we have that snug, we can use a straight screwdriver to tighten it up just a little bit, just to make sure that it doesn't come loose, but not too tight to where we're messing up that nut with the screwdriver. So if you left it set on fast, you should be able to slide the belt right over the motor. Otherwise, you will have to crank the dial to slow it down, and while doing that you have to turn either one of the ends of the shaft, or turn the motor itself, or you have to turn all the components so that that arm does not pinch on the belt, and you don't want to end up breaking the bearing that's on the end of that clip at the end of the control arm. But once you get the belt onto the motor, you make sure everything's lined up correctly, then you can start putting your screws in to fasten your motor to your headstock. And you may have to flip it down on its back more or less in order to get the final screw into the back side of that motor pan. So at this point you can set it up on the motor, and we can put that cover in that is held in by spring tension. You just line the pins up on the side with the notches in the headstock, and you may have to push one of the springs down, and then you should just be able to pop that right in there. So the final place that I recommend lubing is, you can see the spring on the motor there. While it's open like this, it's a good idea to get in there and get a little bit of lubrication inside underneath that spring. And once you got that done, then you can slide your back cover on, as I'm doing here, and put your screws in. And at this point, you can put your your power hubs on. As you can see, there's one long and one short. The long one goes on the top and the shorter one goes on the bottom. So you can do that now, or you could technically wait and do it later when it's actually on the base, and then it may be a little easier for you. It's kind of user preference. So other than that, that'll pretty much wrap up our assembly tutorial. Don't forget to hit subscribe. Leave any comments below, any questions or concerns, anything like that. And thank you for watching. We will see you next time.